record. Yeah, it's not giving me the option to do cloud, so we'll just go with it. All right. Gia, can you confirm that you can see my introductory slide?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put it on presenter mode here.
Yep.
All right, very good. All right, so I lost the ability to see the chat box and things like that. I just see a little video of myself. So if you could help me monitor that. We did get some questions beforehand that we will address throughout this presentation. So if you can take care of anybody that needs to be admitted, that'd be great. Thank you. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Wagner, and I am with Maryland Department of the Environment. So if you're in the session about flood mapping and how the maps affect your premiums and things that you can do, you're in the right session. If you wanted something else, I think you'll have to, as they instructed, leave this breakout room and they'll help you navigate to the appropriate one. But hopefully you'll stay because I think you'll find the information helpful. So welcome again, and again, thank you for being here this afternoon. So we're going to cover a good amount of material, and I have been instructed that I have exactly until 12:55. I better get my watch just to make sure I stay on time here. But Gia, if you can help me with that as well, I'd appreciate it. So we are going to cover quite a few things today as it relates to mapping and reducing your risk. But on the mapping side, I'm going to talk about the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, where you can find them, how to get them. And if we have time, maybe we'll try to do a live demo if that works out. But also I want to kind of prepare you for what's coming in the future as far as flood risk, because the FEMA mapping, while it's a very helpful product, it is kind of the regulatory tool that we use on floodplain management and insurance rating side of things. So it doesn't necessarily, they don't show where all flooding can occur. And then we're going to really dig into this next category, which is how to reduce your risk. What do I mean by that? So in my world, floodplain management world, we deal with floodplain management regulations and different sort of mitigation actions and tools that you can do to reduce your risk. But many of those often translate to reduced flood insurance savings. So hopefully that'll be helpful to you as we move along. I guess a quick note about myself before I get into this, because I don't think I have a slide for our department. No, I didn't put that one in there, sorry. But regarding myself, so basically what I do for the department, I provide assistance related to the National Flood Insurance Program. So a lot of what I'm discussing today is all related to the National Flood Insurance Program and associated policies, associated mapping. I don't really have a lot of information to offer about private flood insurance, but just understand that private flood insurance is separate from the NFIP, which is basically run by the federal government, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So flood insurance can, like I said, it's through the NFIP here, but it's often written by these companies that we call write your own companies. So there's a link that we'll send out with the slide deck, but you can actually Google this and find it yourself. But it's Allstate, it's Farmers, it's Hartford, it's Selective, it's USAA, it's Wright, and there are many others. I think there's about 60 or 70 carriers that write flood insurance on behalf of the National Flood Insurance Program. But like I said, there's also this private market like AIG, Hartford also writes it, Liberty Mutual, Emu, Limu, what's that commercial? You know what I'm talking about? It's a catchy phrase. Nationwide, those are some that write private flood insurance. And the Maryland Insurance Administration actually has a great website where they put a lot of flood insurance information on there. And one of the things they have is this list of all these private flood insurance companies. So if you're looking, to kind of understand, different quotes and things like that, you could contact a private flood insurance if your lender will allow you, because sometimes your lender may only require or only work with those that write National Flood Insurance Program policies. So a little more background about the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program. It was created in 1968 by the National Flood Insurance Act. And up until that point, we've been we were in response mode as a nation. We didn't really have a program that was proactive in preventing disasters. Yeah, we did flood control. Yeah, we did, levee systems and things like that all through the 30s and 40s and 50s. But we didn't really have a good national program devoted to floodplain management. Well, enter the NFIP. That's what it's all about. The last straw, so to speak, was, I think, Hurricane Betsy in 1965. It was a major hurricane. I can't remember if it was a category 4 or 5 that hit the Texas coast. And it was really considered the first billion-dollar disaster. So now we're seeing these kinds of disasters multiple times a year, in back-to-back years and so on and so forth. So it really kind of necessitated this sort of need for a program where we have a partnership between local governments and the federal government. So in my role with the Maryland Department of the Environment, I'm kind of the go-between and provide assistance for the local governments, but I also provide assistance to a variety of other stakeholders, including property owners and business owners and real estate agents and insurance agents / producers, as Insurance Administration reminds me to say that. But anytime people have questions, I'm always glad to try to help. I may not have all the answers, but chances are I probably know somebody who does. So if nothing else you get out of this, just remember my email address that will splash up on the screen. And Gia, if you could maybe put that in the chat box for me, I'd appreciate it. I'm always here to help you. So the program is administered by FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security. Participation is voluntary, but really at the time, there was no other game out there as far as flood insurance. There really wasn't much of a private market. So it was really the only program out there that was selling flood insurance. So I do want to stress that this program is really more than just flood insurance. Again, it's that partnership between the local government. We call them the community, and I think I'll get into that in a second. But it's that partnership between the community and the federal government. And the whole idea is that, you do this floodplain management and you'll get this sort of benefit on the insurance side, but it also is tied to grants and loans, disaster assistance, and things like that. Oftentimes it comes up when, somebody has a federally backed loan, they're borrowing money from a bank, they're in a high risk flood hazard area, and then they're required to carry flood insurance. And then everybody wants to get out of that, but it's not a bad thing. Flood insurance, we need to dispel some of those myths about it. It can be a very positive thing, especially if you're someone like in the South and in Texas, where you had a lot of people that flooded after Hurricane Harvey, for example. Was it 50 some inches of rain they had down there, and they didn't have flood insurance coverage. But for a relatively small amount of money, lots of those folks would have qualified for a policy, would have been $400 or $500, and they would have allowed them access to this flood insurance up to $250,000, $500,000, depending on if you're residential or commercial. But if you don't have that, the federal assistance is very limited. So how this whole program works is, again, you got kind of this tripod of things: the maps, which is the know your risk. I say maps and data because there's a lot of data tied to that. And then the second leg of the tripod would be the reducing your risk. So these are the two sort of categories I'm covering today, and that's the regulations and mitigation related stuff we can do. And then the main sort of balancing leg of this tripod is the flood insurance, the reduce your risk, or excuse me, insure your risk. So on the map and data side, the main tools that we use, the main tools that you're probably familiar with, hopefully, is the flood insurance rate map. That is the initial thing that we look at. Traditionally, it's been like this paper product that you go in and you look at. Am I in or out of that blue shaded area? Oh, good, I'm out. I don't need to worry, right? Wrong. I want to say that everybody is in a flood zone of some sort. I live in the western part of Maryland in the mountains at an elevation of 2,200 feet. So my flood risk, while very low, it is not gone. It's not zero. There's no risk, there's always a chance for runoff and things like that. So everybody has some level of flood risk. It's just a different category. But the map is kind of used as that basis, that tool for determining the flood risk zone that you're in. And that's what we use on the floodplain management and regulatory side of the equation. Sometimes communities have their own identified risks, like high water marks or sea level rise lines or something like that. I'm not really going to get into this other product flood insurance study. That just gets a little bit too deeply in the weeds. But I do want to just point out that this document provides a lot of details about what went into the mapping process and what didn't, So again, the maps don't cover everything, but they do a pretty good job, at least giving you where the high risk areas are. So on that note, the flood insurance rate maps, again, there's some great tools for us at the state and local levels, but they don't show you where all flooding can occur. Certainly flooding can happen outside of these boundaries, but it's our national standard. It's what the National Flood Insurance Program is based on. It's commonly referred to, these risk areas, the high risk areas of the 1% annual chance flood or the special flood hazard area. We usually say 100-year floodplain, but understand when we say 100-year floodplain, it doesn't mean that a flood of that magnitude is only going to happen once every 100 years. It's just there's a 1 in 100 chance of a flood of that magnitude of occurring. So, FEMA likes us to say the 1% annual chance. It just doesn't really roll off the tongue. But anyway, that's the national standard of what the insurance and the local plan review, development, floodplain management process is all based on. So on those maps, there are different flood risk zones. And again, it's kind of based on risk category. Are we talking high, moderate, or low risk? You'll see a zone labeled as X, and it will either be shaded or unshaded. And I'll show you an example in a second. And if it's unshaded, it's a low risk. It's less than a 0.2% chance of occurrence. And if it's shaded, it's a 0.2% chance of occurrence, or also commonly referred to as the 500-year floodplain. But the ones we commonly focus on are these red highlighted ones, the A, AH, AO, AE, and VE. So these are riverine and coastal areas, and those are our common 100-year floodplains. But there is a mandatory purchase requirement for structures that are in those zones. Sometimes it comes up when the property touches this as well. And sometimes that's a lender's prerogative, but the actual legal requirement is if the structure is in the high risk area. The other thing to quickly mention when we're talking about mapping is, there's elevations tied with these, flood hazard areas. We call them the base flood elevation. That's basically what height that 1% annual chance flood will get in any given year. But that is often shown on the firm, but sometimes it's not. And that's where we might have to go back to the flood insurance study to get more details. So I have a couple of examples of different zones here to kind of show you these different areas. And I'm hopefully not picking on anybody in the audience. I just randomly selected areas throughout the state. So if you happen to know where this is, it wasn't intentional. But an A zone is traditionally a FEMA zone where they've showed the high risk or 1% annual chance or 100-year floodplain, but they didn't provide any elevation. So there's no base flood elevations. The good news in Maryland is if you come across or you're in or you have to deal with an A zone, in Maryland, we do have model-backed A zones. So we do have cross sections and elevations that we can get that I'll talk about at MD flood maps later on. So that's the A zone. It's still a high risk area. It's just the BFE isn't shown on the map. Next one I wanted to point out, and hopefully this looks familiar to everybody in our state, but this is our state capital, this great city of Annapolis, and this is the city dock area, Ego Alley, as they refer to this area where you turn the boats around and stuff like that. But this is a tidal floodplain. So this is also a high risk flood hazard area in blue. And you can see it's an AE zone. That means it's an A zone with an elevation. And since it's tidal, it has a static flood elevation of 5 feet. So that means that the base flood elevation is 5 feet, and the elevation is above mean sea level. It's not above ground, it's above mean sea level. So often a surveyor will have to help you kind of, figure out where that falls on the structure. The other areas I wanted to point out here are the orange areas. are labeled as the 500-year floodplain. So that would be considered the 0.2% chance. And you'll also see it as a shaded zone X on the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. So that's A and AE. And then I got a Riverine example of an AE zone. And this is hopefully this one looks somewhat familiar to you too, at least with the text, but this is Ellicott City. And obviously there were some catastrophic flood events there in recent years, but flooding really goes back to the 1700s in this particular area. There's a really nice museum there in Ellicott City. If you get a chance to check it out, there's some great displays and memorabilia in there that provides more on the history of the town. But again, the blue area is the high risk flood hazard area, and the orange would be the 500-year or 0.2%. So really the insurance and regulatory requirements, again, are only required in that blue shaded area. But we want to make people aware of these other zones on the map, you know. So if you're in a 0.2 or 500-year flood zone, consider buying flood insurance. If you're just outside these lines, consider buying flood insurance. You can get a policy on the residential side for as little as like $400 a year. On the coastal side, I picked an example in Ocean City, and this happens to be a favorite family vacation spot for us at the Princess Royale. There's a lot to keep the kids busy there, in addition to the pool and the arcade and of course the beach. But anyway, this kind of shows you on the coastal side where you have these VE zones. VE zones are a little bit different because they have some velocity, they have wave action that goes with them. So VE zones have a 3-foot breaking weight that's built into them when they map them. And you're probably wondering, well, why does that line automatically stop right at the edge? And the reason being is there's a dune system along the ocean front there. And that dune system has met the federal mapping requirements to help reduce the 1% annual chance flood event. So that's why you don't see any shading just beyond that area. So a lot of those buildings are technically in a low risk. I didn't say no risk, I said low risk flood hazard area. So if they don't have a loan, there isn't a requirement for flood insurance, but obviously we would still encourage it given the potential risk there. And I think this is my last example I wanted to throw in because this is something you'll sometimes see on the maps. And this is a riverine area of a floodway where the velocities of the floodwaters are moving through the area pretty swiftly. So you'll see this hatched area, we call it a floodway. And I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of how it's determined, but just understand that it's still considered a high risk flood hazard area. But on the development side, if somebody wanted to do a building or a stream crossing across a floodway, there might be some extra steps involved. It's discouraged to do development in these floodways, but if you do it, you just have some extra steps on the engineering and analysis side to show that you're not going to impact others, and it'll be safe. And I think this is in Midland in Western Maryland, Allegheny County. So that's a nod to our Western Maryland folks. So where do I find all this information? So there's a lot of different sources. So I've shown you some screenshots from an application I'll talk about in a second, but I did want to recognize FEMA's Map Service Center. There's a ton of information on there. And really the interface is quite simple. You can see the screenshot. All you need to do is just type in your address and do a search, and it will automatically bring some products up and mapping up that you can immediately start engaging with. So that's a great resource. And there's a couple of different things on there. A lot of this you probably won't need, some of it you might, but one of the neat things is you can make like a FIRMette. It's a little sort of portion of the flood insurance rate map that looks like this. So if you use their web mapping tool and drill through the floodplain maps and the PDFs, and you can create this little snippet. And I always encourage people to try to do this because as a property owner myself, when I purchased my house, there was a process that was happening behind the scenes with the mortgage company and the flood determination company that works for them, that they kind of review these maps and see, what your risk is. And that's what's ultimately decided whether or not you have to carry flood insurance. But it's good for you to be informed and have this in your you know, in your repository of information. So, you know, attempt to do this on your own. See if you can find the map panel. And the nice thing about it, it gives you the panel information. It gives you the scale and the little snippet of the map. So you can download this as a PDF or a PNG file, which is a image file. And you can also use their really cool National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. It's like GIS or Geographic Information System data. So it's very similar to what I showed you before. So all this stuff is representing the same kind of information in just different ways. But this is nice because it also provides a nice, you know, picture that you have of the area. It also provides the legend that describes more information. And you can also download this as a PDF or a PNG file. In Maryland, we have an awesome site. It's the flood risk application, mdfloodmaps.net. So that's one I'd really encourage you to take a look at, in addition to the FEMA Map Service Center, but it's local. This particular example I have up is a place that's near and dear to my heart. And this is in Baltimore City, Southwest Baltimore, Frederick Avenue area. We've been working a lot with the community on different projects in that area. But again, the blue shaded area is the high risk flood hazard area. And you got the little squigglies there that show you the base flood elevation. And these numbers are rounded for insurance purposes. So, you know, if we're doing development or you need to get some more precise elevation information for your structure, we'd want to go to that other document, the flood insurance study, to get more information, more details. But similarly, you can also, you know, eventually download a map. And if we have time, I'll do a live demo of this. And you can create this flood risk map of your property as well. It has all this information about the panels and, you know, a legend and things like that. And currently we only are able to download it as a PDF. I'm sure you could do a save as a PNG or image file, whatever you want. But that's that. But related to elevations, you know, something that would be extremely helpful to me and to your local floodplain manager and local government is to have something called an elevation certificate. And that's basically a form that a licensed surveyor would fill out and provide all the elevation information. And this is going to be used not only for floodplain management and development purposes, but also for flood insurance rating. So even if your house was built in 1948, way before this program existed, we'd consider that a pre-firm or pre-flood insurance rate map structure. Oftentimes, older structures can still benefit from elevation ratings. So even though there's a cost on the front end, you might find that you might actually save money in the long term if you have an elevation certificate. And before you ask, we don't have copies of them in our office, you know, unless it's part of a permit review or some kind of analysis we're helping a local government or property owner with. We don't have a repository of that in the state. Sometimes the local government will have it, but not always. As far as future flood risk, I wanted to talk just a couple moments about this thing called the Coast Smart Climate Ready Action Boundary. So right now, this has just been developed for tidal and coastal areas in the state. So, you know, think around the Chesapeake Bay and the Ocean City and the back coastal Bay area. And what we did is we're trying to prepare our state. And this whole program, why it was set up, is the state, when they make an investment in projects and infrastructure, they want to do it in a responsible way. So we're looking at not only the FEMA maps, but what we're doing is we're adding 3 feet to the FEMA maps and then extending that out horizontally to see where that falls. So we're calling it the CRAB, or Climate Ready Action Boundary. So you can see there's an arrow pointing to where the FEMA base flood elevation is. And if we were to add 3 feet vertically to that and then extend that out to the left horizontally, that's that CRAB elevation that we're getting. And basically in that newly inundated area that's highlighted is where we want to kind of, you know, on the state side, we want to build higher. So we don't want to build it just on the ground. We want to, you know, add it to an elevation. We're offering this service to all local governments. It is publicly available as well. If you hit the link at the bottom there, it's mdfloodmaps.net/CRAB. But at least give you an idea of what it looks like, the depth of flooding in your particular area. And we have it set at 1, 2, and 3 feet. The other neat thing that's happening out there, and that's coming, is on realtor.com, they have actually added not only the FEMA flood insurance rate map information, you can see by this example in Annapolis, the lower left corner, but they've also added this data file called Flood Factor. And it was produced by First Street Foundation. And it's kind of looking at what the future flood risk is. And not only what current standards are based on, but what could happen based on drainage, based on more intense rainfall, things like that. So you can kind of get a sense of what the risk could be there. So I really like that. You can kind of look between both of those. And there's also kind of a mechanism in here where you can purchase flood insurance through realtor.com. And I think it's underwritten by Wright Flood Insurance, if I'm not mistaken. So that was kind of the know your risk category. And now I'm going to jump over to the reduce your risk, and I have a lot of graphics to kind of help explain this and maybe help you with your insurance rating. So I don't want to get too deeply in the regulations because that tends to be the boring part of the conversation, but it's such an important part because when you're doing new development, we want to do it in a way that's going to reduce the risk. And every local government that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program in Maryland has to adopt minimum standards. So those minimum standards are based on, federal regulations and other things, but that is the meat of what kind of sets up local floodplain management programs. So each one of those communities, depending upon where you live, some have adopted higher standards, things such as Freeboard, which is a factor of safety where you elevate even higher. So I'll show you kind of an example of what that means here in a second. But I also want to point out that there's also this thing called the building code that when you're doing structures and things like that. So there's a lot of flood damage resistant provisions that are embedded in that building code as well. So really come a long way in the last 10, 15 years as far as codes and regulations. And they're really not meant to be, invasive or, try to block your project. I think you'll find that most local government officials are trying to find ways that would support your project, but doing it in a way that would reduce the risk and ultimately reduce the insurance costs. So Freeboard, like I said, is a factor of safety. We keep using that term base flood elevation. That's the minimum elevation that's shown on the FEMA maps. Most communities in Maryland are adopting a 2-foot freeboard, so they're going 2 feet above that. And as you can see with this schematic, the higher you go up, the lower your premium goes. So if you're 4 feet below BFE, well, your premium is like $5,000 a year based on when this was developed. But if you're at BFE, you're looking at about $2,000 a year. But if you're 3 feet above the base flood elevation, hey, and that lines up with that CoSmart climate ready action boundary I just mentioned, you're looking at less than $500 a year. So it really can save you money over time. So here's just a couple of examples for you. Here's another favorite spot of mine in Crisfield. I vacation a lot there with the family at Janes Island State Park. But this is an elevated, very common construction type in Maryland, elevated on a crawl space foundation, block foundation. But you'll notice these are little black things at the bottom. Those are flood openings. Those are really important. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a second. Especially important on the insurance rating side. Another example I wanted to show you, remember how I highlighted Ocean City as a velocity zone, VE zone, but we do have velocity zones going up the bay. And this particular example is in Calvert County, really beautiful structure on the waterfront, and you can actually peek through. But the difference with VE zones is they are open foundation systems. Any enclosures have to have like these things called breakaway walls that will automatically collapse under a certain amount of water pressure. So that's just a common difference between an AE zone and a VE zone. All right, so moving into the mitigation action category, where are we at? Time check here, 1:37. All right, we're good. And I want to make sure we have time for questions too. But in the mitigation actions, so there's all kinds of things listed here. Flood damage resistant materials, I'll get into that. Flood openings, which I've mentioned a couple times, we'll get into that. Backflow prevention valves. So in public sewer systems, water supply systems, usually the municipality is responsible from the property line, to the municipal property area. But on your property, you are responsible. And, one of the things you might want to consider is installing backflow prevention valves if you're able. So it's a little bit more difficult sometimes to retrofit these, but sometimes it's not. Elevating the HVAC systems, the utilities, you can see the picture here. This is from Cecil County, getting those units up off of the ground. That is a quick $2,000 loss plus probably. I haven't shopped for these things recently, but this is a preventable damage that we can do simply by elevating these off the ground. Anchoring fuel tanks, oil tanks, propane tanks, and extending the vent pipes. Accessory structures, those sheds and other things that are kind of behind our houses or beside our houses, anchoring those as well are good. But there's an acronym that's commonly used in the mitigation world, and it's called FRED: floodproof, relocate, elevate, demolish. Demolish isn't always a favored, mitigation technique, especially if it's a historic structure, but sometimes it's a necessary one if there are no other viable alternatives. But I would like to point out one of the most important and viable mitigation tools that you have right now, everybody in Maryland has, is buying flood insurance. Because your community participates, anybody can buy flood insurance. It doesn't matter if you're in a high-risk area or not, anyone can purchase it. So flood damage resistant materials. And this is things like cement board, brick and tile, marine grade plywood, sprayed polyurethane foam insulation, things that you could take the hose out, rinse it off, and be back and ready to go in a matter of minutes. What we don't want to use is drywall. We don't want to use traditional fiberglass insulation or oriented strand board, that OSB stuff. Once that gets wet, you can't dry it out. Oftentimes mold will happen, so you'll, after a flood event, that first 3 or 4 feet is often cut out. And I think there's things that we could do as we're building and rebuilding, give some thought to flood damage resistant materials, because I think that could really help. On the fastener and connector side, rather than just using a traditional sort of steel nail or something like that, use something that's galvanized, that's meant to get wet and be in weather conditions. Flood openings, I've been saying this multiple times already, but basically these are things in the foundation that allow floodwaters to enter and exit the space without human intervention. So there are a variety of things on the market. You can get engineered openings like you see in the lower left corner, but you could use things like in the upper right corner and just turn a block sideways. You could use lattice work. But generally speaking, the requirement is to have 1 square inch of net open area for every square foot of enclosure. So you can do that through, again, turn the block sideways. But if you, in the case of an engineered opening, this has gone through a certification and a formal process that some of these flood openings are certified for 230 square feet. So again, it just depends on what product you use, depends on how many openings are required. But the whole point of them are to reduce that hydrostatic pressure during a flood event. And these are a tremendous insurance saver that we all need to be more familiar with. Here's some more schematics out of a magazine I thought were pretty good, but it's just illustrating on the left side when that elevation, that BFE gets up, that blue area, and those flood openings. I didn't mention this, but they have to be within 1 foot of grade. So if it's 3 feet up in the air, they're not really going to count as flood openings unless they're within 1 foot of the interior grade. So if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that this profile, the outside grade on the left matches the interior grade. But sometimes the interior grade might be higher or lower. But as long as the flood opening is within 12 inches of grade, and it doesn't matter if it's interior or exterior, then you'll get the benefit of those flood openings and reduced insurance costs. So hopefully that makes sense. Backflow prevention valves, I talked about these, but this is just an example. So this might be like an air access point on your property where you could install one of these backflow prevention valves. I have a grinder pump on my particular property. So I think there's a way that we could probably tie into the system, just near that or in that system there. But backflow prevention valves prevent that, during a flood event from all that back pressure of the floodwaters backing up into your house. HVAC units. This is an example of that again. I think I showed that once or twice already. But this is just an example. I think this is Dorchester County, where we have not only flood openings, but also the HVAC systems. And these enclosures, these areas below the elevated floor, you can see the deck off to the left. Really, these areas are only supposed to be used for parking, access, and limited storage. Utilities. What can I do? Well, I mean, there are things you could do in a basement. You could put them on platforms like this. I'll show you a flood barrier in a second. But, oftentimes this will kind of affect your insurance rate a little bit. It may not, make it jump thousands of dollars, but these are just kind of things that you could do to help reduce the overall premium. Something neat you could do is dry floodproof. So if you don't have the ability to elevate it, there are ways where you could actually build walls around these utilities and have like a protection device. If you have to have a door, it would be sealed and latched and all that kind of stuff. But there are ways that you could do that to protect that equipment. Fuel tanks, can't stress this one enough. We've had a lot of issues with this over the years with not only oil tanks, but propane tanks being lifted up. They are buoyant, they float, even if they're full, and they will spill. And if it's oil, it creates a big mess. So we want those to be anchored to the concrete or to the ground. And in the case of oil tanks, you want the vent pipe to be extended because you don't want the floodwaters to get into your fuel tank. And you want this, the filler tube to be sealed and all that good stuff. Here's an example of a propane tank that's anchored. I don't know if I threw any pictures in here, but I'm sure you've seen them outside servicing. But there's just these really simple straps that you can get to connect these things and strap them down to the ground. Same on the outside for oil tanks. Whoops, sorry. And then the last thing here is about accessory structures. So we don't want to forget about them. They're necessary things to store our, lawn equipment and all of our toys and bikes and things like that. But we want these to be anchored. And since it's an enclosure below that base flood elevation, they also have to have flood openings, especially if they're new. That would be a requirement by the community. And of course, elevating any kind of electrical and mechanical equipment servicing them. Okay, and then one of the last couple of things here is related to risk rating 2.0. We talked about future flood risk. So FEMA is going to be revising the way they do flood insurance rating. So new rates are going to start on October 1st I think they're going to concentrate on residential first. But the thing in red here is what's very interesting to me is that they're going to initially provide credits for these 3 mitigation actions. And these are things that we just kind of talked about a little bit: installing flood openings, elevating on post piles or piers, which sometimes you can do, sometimes you can't. But in coastal environments, having those lower areas that, remember the VE zones, having that free of obstruction is going to be really important. And then elevating machinery and equipment above the lowest floor. So they're going to use different characteristics such as distance to the coast, different types of flood risk, and the cost to rebuild a home. So this is effectively kind of changing the way things are going to be rated into the future. But there are things that we could do that help reduce that. But it's not all doom and gloom, because there's about 61% of the policies in Maryland. We have 65,000 policies in Maryland. About 61% are actually going to see a decrease. So again, for the other 39%, there will be an increase. And there's different categories just depending on the risk factor and things like that. But Maryland, if you look at nationally, we're among like the top 3 as far as coming out ahead as risk rating 2.0. All right, so I talked about this elevation certificate before, and I'm going to say it again, but this could be a very helpful tool, not only to help on the community regulation side, to make sure it's properly elevated, has the flood openings, and that's all documented in this form, but it's used for flood insurance rating purposes. And it can be used for challenging the FEMA maps if you wanted to pursue a letter of map amendment. But, on the insurance side, this is just critically important. Can't stress it enough. So even though it might cost you some money on the front end, you're going to probably find that it might save you money in the long term. So if you're buying a house, maybe the seller has a copy, possibly the community might have a copy, but not always. But in Maryland, usually only a licensed surveyor can do this form. There are some caveats I won't get into, but if you go to marylandsurveyor.org and use their Find a Surveyor tool, you can easily find a surveyor that can help you. Publications, there's a lot of good ones out there. We'll send the slide deck out. One of my favorites is this Protect Your Home from Flooding, low-cost projects you can do yourself. So these aren't really expensive things. These are things like flood openings, installing sump pumps, using flood damage resistant materials. So all these things that we've been talking about throughout this discussion here are in this guide, and you can click on the link once you get it, or you can just Google this yourself and you'll have that. And the last thing I guess I just wanted to make you aware of, not really get too deeply in, is some communities. So we have 147 communities in Maryland that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So all of our county governments and most municipal governments, a percentage of them, 15 of them, of that 147 participate in this varsity team called the Community Rating System. So communities like Baltimore City, Prince George's County, Caroline County, City of Frederick, Harford County, et cetera, they all participate in this program. And as a result of that, you, as the insured, will receive a discount if your structure is located in a high-risk area. So it's good to be aware of that. Websites, we'll send that out as well. But that's really all I had. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing. And I did want to go to 2 questions I received ahead of time. Hopefully there's no audio issues still. I see somebody was asking that question.
All audio has been taken care of.
Okay, good. But I wanted to point out, we have 5 minutes left here. Deborah McCallum from Lanham, Maryland asked about, she lives in a townhome. She moved there 25 years ago, and every time it rains, it turns into a swampy mess. We hear about this a lot. A lot of these are drainage issues. These are just issues of water not having anywhere to go. So what can you do? The first thing I think I'd recommend is to go to your local jurisdiction. In this case, I think it's Prince George's County government. Report the problem. It sounds like you might have already done that, considering the number of times you've flooded. But they do have a 311 system, and that it's important to log it, in their system. So that's the first and foremost. But the other follow-up question that she asks is, what can be done, and do I need flood insurance? So look at the drainage. We didn't really get into rain gardens and rain barrels and downspouts and that sort of thing, but trying to get the water away from your structure, making sure your gutters are clean is something you can certainly do. And yes, flood insurance is certainly available to you. And because Prince George's County is a Class 5 community, if you're in a high-risk area, you could save up to 25% on your premium. And if you're a moderate risk, you'd save, I think it's 10 or 15%. So hopefully we addressed that one. And then the other question I had was from Grace Scott in Baltimore County. And she asked about the flood maps in Baltimore County that were being updated. So that process is going on right now, Grace. So if you go to mdfloodmaps.net, we have a listing there of sort of updates and where we are in the mapping process for all the counties throughout the state. So Baltimore County is going through an update of some of their riverine areas, not the coastal or tidal, but that is happening, and they are not finalized yet. So there's going to be a public outreach opportunity actually in May. So be on the lookout for some information from Baltimore County. Gia, was there any questions in the chat box that came up?
No, there aren't any questions. I just sent everyone a message asking if there were any questions to place them in the chat, but there hasn't been any responses yet. Okay.
Well, I do appreciate everyone getting on with us today. So hopefully this was helpful, but just to recap, elevation certificate is really good to have. Having flood openings in your structure, especially if you're in a AE or A zone, having flood openings in an enclosure below the base flood elevation is really important. elevating electrical, mechanical equipment, anchoring fuel tanks. These are all things that could really sort of help with your flood insurance premium. Larger scale projects, if you're thinking major renovation projects, if you wanted to elevate your home, you know, certainly that's something you could do, would be very helpful, but obviously there's an increased cost with that. But if you're doing an addition, you know, elevating that addition, and there might be some requirements there anyway on the permitting side, but, you know, elevating what you can, being aware of your risk, going to MD flood maps, even checking out realtor.com, and that flood factor tool is really cool. You can turn on, you know, the flood link. So I think that's about all the time I have, because I think we're going to get kicked out in 2 minutes. I didn't have time to do the live demo, but please take a look at mdfloodmaps.net. And I think my contact information was included, but I'm going to just go ahead and put my email address in there. Feel free to give me a shout, ask me a question. I'm always glad to help. But with that, I guess we'll, oh, good. We have a question here. Is there any flood mitigation grant available to public to implement? Yes, very good question. They are often coordinated through your local emergency services group. But yeah, there are a variety of different grants that you could get through the Maryland Emergency Management Agency. They manage the FEMA hazard mitigation grants. You could also look in our department. We do have a comprehensive flood management grant program, but usually property owners can't apply directly. The local government or a nonprofit has to apply on their behalf. So it's really good for you to get to know your local government representatives that are in emergency services, your floodplain managers, and all that good stuff. So yeah, there are grants and tools out there. The criteria vary, but let me know if you have any follow-up questions about that. And I think we're about to get booted off. What's needed to get the elevation certificate? Really, you just need to contact the surveyor. You don't really need anything, but you know, they're going to probably require a fee, you know, so money will be required. And that cost varies depending upon where you are in the state. You know, I know some surveyors that will do them for as little as like $300–400 on the shore. But depending upon where you are in the state, how far the surveyor has to go to get control to your area to establish that elevation, the cost kind of varies, but check out marylandsurveyor.org. With that, I'm going to say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. The breakout room will automatically close in 48 seconds.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gia.
You're welcome.
Gia, do I need to stop recording, or will it stop recording automatically, you think, once we leave?
I don't know. Maybe you should stop.
Okay.
And great job.